back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about half an hour of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev, and we are reading A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. We're reading Chapter 11, Robber Barons and Rebels. Just finished talking about the Chicago Haymarket affair. And let's just dig right in. Some of the energy of resentment in late 1886 was poured into the electoral campaign for mayor of New York that fall. Trade unions formed an independent Labor Party and nominated for mayor Henry George, the radical economist whose Progress in Poverty had been read by tens of thousands of workers. George's platform tells something about the condition of life for workers in New York in the 1880s. It demanded, number one, that prosperity qualifications be abolished for members of juries. Two, that grand jurors be chosen from the lower class as well as from the upper class, which dominated grand juries. Three, that the police not interfere with peaceful meetings. Four, that the sanitary inspection of buildings be enforced. 5, that contract labor be abolished in public works. 6, that there be equal pay for equal work for women. 7, that the streetcars be owned by the municipal government. The Democrats nominated an iron manufacturer, Abram Hewitt, and the Republicans nominated Theodore Roosevelt at a convention presided over by Elihu Root, a corporation lawyer, with the nominating speech given by Chauncey Depew, a railroad director. In a campaign of coercion and bribery, Hewitt was elected with 41% of the vote. George came in second with 31% of the vote, and Roosevelt third with 27% of the vote. The New York World saw this as a signal. The deep-voiced protest conveyed in the 67,000 votes for Henry George against the combined power of both political parties, of Wall Street and the business interests, and of the public press, should be a warning to the community to heed the demands of labor so far as they are just and reasonable. In other cities in the country, too, labor candidates ran, polling 25,000 out of 92,000 votes in Chicago, electing a mayor in Milwaukee, and various local officials in Fort Worth, Texas, Eaton, Ohio, and Leadville, Colorado. It seemed that the weight of Haymarket had not crushed the labor movement. The year 1886 became known to contemporaries as the year of the Great Uprising of Labor. From 1881 to 1885, strikes had averaged about 500 each year, involving perhaps 150,000 workers each year. In 1886, there were over 1,400 strikes, involving 500,000 workers. John Commons, in his History of the Labor Movement of the United States, saw in that I told you Hermione likes the spotlight. John Commons, in his History of the Labor Movement of the United States, saw in that the signs of a great movement by the class of the unskilled, which has finally risen in rebellion. The movement bore in every way the aspect of a social war. A frenzied hatred of labor for capital was shown in every important strike. Extreme bitterness toward capital manifested itself in all the actions of the Knights of Labor, and wherever the leaders undertook to hold it within bounds, they were generally discarded by their followers. Even among Southern blacks, where all the military, political, and economic force of the Southern states, with the acquiescence of the national government, was concentrated on keeping them docile and working. There were sporadic rebellions. In the cotton fields, blacks were dispersed in their work, but in the sugar fields, work was done in gangs, so there was opportunity for organized action. In 1880, they had struck to get $1 a day instead of 75 cents, threatening to leave the state. Strikers were arrested and jailed, but they walked the roads along the sugar fields carrying banners, $1 a day or Kansas. They were arrested again and again for trespassing, and the strike was broken. By 1886, however, the Knights of Labor was organizing in the sugar fields. In the peak year of the Knights' influence, the black workers, unable to feed and clothe their families on their wages, often paid in store scrip, asked $1 a day once more. The following year, in the fall, close to 10,000 sugar laborers went on strike, 90% of them Negroes and members of the Knights. The militia arrived and gun battles began. Violence erupted in the town of Chpt, which had become a kind of refugee village where hundreds of strikers evicted from their plantation shacks gathered, penniless and ragged, carrying their bed clothing and babies. Their refusal to work threatened the entire sugar crop, and martial law was declared in Chpt. Henry and George Cox, two Negro brothers, leaders in the Knights of Labor, were arrested, locked up, then taken from their cells and never heard from again. On the night of November 22nd, shooting broke out, each side claiming the other was at fault. By noon the next day, 30 Negroes were dead or dying and hundreds wounded. 2 whites were wounded. A Negro newspaper in New Orleans wrote, "Lame men and blind women shot, children and hoary-headed grandsires ruthlessly swept down. The Negroes offered no resistance. They could not, as the killing was unexpected. Those of them not killed took to the woods, a majority of them finding refuge in this city. Citizens of the United States killed by a mob directed by a state judge. Laboring men seeking an advance in wages treated as if they were dogs. At such times and upon such occasions, words of condemnation fall like snowflakes upon molten lead. The blacks should defend their lives, and if needs must die, die with their faces toward the persecutors, fighting for their homes, their children, and their lawful rights." Native-born poor whites were not doing well either. In the South, they were tenant farmers rather than landowners. In the southern cities, they were tenants, not homeowners. C. Van Woodward notes that the city with the highest rate of tenancy in the United States was Birmingham with 90%, and the slums of the southern cities were among the worst, poor whites living like the blacks on unpaved dirt streets, choked up with garbage, filth, and mud, according to a report of one state board of health. There were eruptions against the convict labor system in the South, in which prisoners were leased in slave labor to corporations, used thus to depress the general level of wages and also to break strikes. In the year 1891, miners of the Tennessee Coal Mine Company were asked to sign an ironclad contract pledging no strikes, agreeing to get paid in scrip, and giving up the right to check the weight of the coal they mined. They were paid by the weight. They refused to sign and were evicted from their houses. Convicts were brought in to replace them. On the night of October 31st, 1891, 1,000 armed miners took control of the mine area, set 500 convicts free, and burned down the stockades in which the convicts were kept. The companies surrendered, agreeing not to use convicts, not to require the ironclad contract, and to let the miners check on the weight of the coal they mined. The following year, there were more such incidents in Tennessee. C. Van Woodward calls them insurrections. Miners overpowered guards of the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company, burned the stockades, shipped the convicts to Nashville. Excuse me. Other unions in Tennessee came to their aid. An observer reported back to the Chattanooga Federation of Trades, "I should like to impress upon people the extent of this movement. I have seen the written assurance of reinforcements to the miners of fully 7,500 men, who will be on the field in 10 hours after the first shot is fired. The entire district is as one over the main proposition: the convicts must go. I counted 840 rifles on Monday as the miners passed, while the vast multitude following them carried revolvers. The captains of the different companies are all Grand Army men. Whites and Negroes are standing shoulder to shoulder." That same year in New Orleans, 42 Union locals with over 20,000 members, mostly white but including some blacks — there was one black on the strike committee — called a general strike involving half the population of the city. Work in New Orleans came to a stop. After 3 days, with strikebreakers brought in, martial law, and the threat of militia, the strike ended with a compromise, gaining hours and wages, but without recognition of the unions as bargaining agents. The year 1892 saw strike struggles all over the country. Besides the general strike in New Orleans and the coal miners' strike in Tennessee, there was a railroad switchmen's strike in Buffalo, New York, and a copper miners' strike in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The Coeur d'Alene strike was marked by gun battles between strikers and strikebreakers and many deaths. A newspaper account of July 11, 1892 reported, "The long-dreaded conflict between the forces of the strikers and the non-union men who have taken their places has come at last. As a result, 5 men are known to be dead and 16 are already in the hospital. The Frisco mill on Canyon Creek is in ruins. The gem mine has surrendered to the strikers. The arms of its employees have been captured, and the employees themselves have been ordered out of the country." Out of the country? Flushed with the success of these victories, the turbulent element among the strikers are preparing to move upon other strongholds of the non-union men. The National Guard brought in by the governor was reinforced by federal troops. 600 miners were rounded up and imprisoned in bullpens. Scabs brought back. Union leaders fired. The strike broken. In early 1892, the Carnegie Steel Plant at Homestead, Pennsylvania, just outside of Pittsburgh, was being managed by Henry Clay Frick while Carnegie was in Europe. Frick decided to reduce the workers' wages and break their union. He built a fence 3 miles long and 12 feet high around the steelworks and topped it with barbed wire, adding peepholes for rifles. When the workers did not accept the pay cut, Frick laid off the entire workforce. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was hired to break strikebreakers. To protect strikebreakers. Although only 750 of the 3,800 workers at Homestead belonged to a union, 3,000 workers met in the Opera House and voted overwhelmingly to strike. The plant was on the Monongahela River, and 1,000 pickets began patrolling a 10-mile stretch of the river. A committee of strikers took over the town, and the sheriff was unable to raise a posse among local people against them. On the night of July 5th, 1892, hundreds of Pinkerton guards boarded barges 5 miles down the river from Homestead and moved toward the plant, where 10,000 workers and sympathizers waited. The crowd warned the Pinkertons not to step off the barge. A striker lay down on the gangplank, and when a Pinkerton man tried to shove him aside, he fired, wounding the detective in the thigh. In the gunfire that followed on both sides, 7 workers were killed. The Pinkertons had to retreat onto the barges. They were attacked from all sides, voted to surrender, and then were beaten by the enraged crowd. Wow. After they surrendered, they were beaten. I'm not sure the crowd got what surrender meant. There were dead on both sides. For the next several days, the strikers were in command of the area. Now the state went into action. The governor brought in the militia, armed with the latest rifles and Gatling guns to protect the import of strikebreakers. Strike leaders were charged with murder. 160 other strikers were tried for other crimes. All were acquitted by friendly juries. The entire strike committee was then arrested for treason against the state, but no jury would convict them. The strike held for 4 months, but the plant was producing steel with strikebreakers who were brought in, often in locked trains, not knowing their destination, not knowing a strike was on. The strikers, with no resources left, agreed to return to work. Their leaders blacklisted. One reason for the defeat was that the strike was confined to Homestead, and other plants of Carnegie kept working. Some blast furnace workers did strike, but they were quickly defeated, and the pig iron from those furnaces was then used at Homestead. The defeat kept unionization from the Carnegie plants well into the 20th century, and the workers took wage cuts and increases in hours without organized resistance. In the midst of the Homestead strike, a young anarchist from New York named Alexander Berkman, in a plan prepared by anarchist friends in New York, including his lover Emma Goldman, came to Pittsburgh and entered the office of Henry Clay Frick, determined to kill him. Berkman's aim was poor. He wounded Frick and was overwhelmed, then was tried and found guilty of attempted murder. He served 14 years in the state penitentiary. His prison memoirs of an anarchist gave a graphic description of the assassination attempt and of his years in prison, when he changed his mind about the usefulness of assassinations, but remained a dedicated revolutionary. Emma Goldman's autobiography, Living My Life, conveys the anger, the sense of injustice, the desire for a new kind of life that grew among the young radicals of that day. The year 1893 saw the biggest economic crisis in the country's history. After several decades of wild industrial growth, financial manipulation, uncontrolled speculation, and profiteering, it all collapsed. 642 banks failed, and 16,000 businesses closed down. Out of the labor force of 15 million, 3 million were unemployed. 20% unemployment. No state government voted relief, but mass demonstrations all over the country forced city governments to set up soup kitchens and give people work on streets or parks. In New York City, in Union Square, Emma Goldman addressed a huge meeting of the unemployed and urged those with children. What? Urged those with children needed food to go into the stores and take it? Oh, telling them to steal food for their children. Sorry, getting tired. She was arrested for inciting to riot and sentenced to 2 years in prison. In Chicago, it was estimated that 200,000 people were without work. The floors and stairways of City Hall and the police stations packed every night with homeless men trying to sleep. The Depression lasted for years and brought a wave of strikes throughout the country. The largest of these was the nationwide strike of railroad workers in 1894 that began at the Pullman Company in Illinois, just outside of Chicago. Annual wages of railroad workers, according to the report of the Commission of Labor in 1890, were $957 for engineers, the aristocrats of the railroad, but $575 for conductors, $212 for brakemen, and $125 for laborers. Railroad work was one of the most dangerous jobs in America. Over 2,000 railroad workers were being killed each year and 30,000 injured. The railroad companies called those acts of God, or the results of carelessness on the part of the workers. But the Locomotive Foreman's magazine said, it came to this: while railroad managers reduce their force and require men to do double duty involving loss of sleep and rest, the accidents are chargeable on the greed of the corporation. It was the Depression of 1893 that propelled Eugene Debs into a lifetime of action for unionism and socialism. Ouch. Here. Debs was from Terre Haute, Indiana, where his father and mother ran a store. He had worked on the railroads for 4 years until he was 19, but left when a friend was killed after falling under a locomotive. He came back to join a railroad brotherhood as a billing clerk. At the time of the great strikes of 1877, Debs opposed them and argued there was no necessary conflict between capital and labor. But when he read Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, it deeply affected him. He followed the events at Homestead, Coeur d'Alene, the Buffalo Switchmen's strike, and wrote, in the year 1892, if the year 1892 taught the workmen any lesson worthy of heed, it was that the capitalist class, like a devilfish, had grasped them with its tentacles and was dragging them down to fathomless depths of degradation. To escape the prehensile clutch of these monsters constitutes a standing challenge to organized labor for 1893. In the midst of the economic crisis of 1893, a small group of railroad workers, including Debs, formed the American Railway Union to unite all railway workers. Debs said, a life purpose of mine has been the Federation of Railroad Employees. To unify them into one great body is my object. Class enrollment fosters class prejudices and class selfishness. It has been my life's desire to unify railroad employees and to eliminate the aristocracy of labor and organize them all, so all will be on an equality. Knights of Labor people came in, virtually merging the old Knights with the American Railway Union, according to labor historian David Montgomery. Debs wanted to include everyone, but blacks were kept out. At a convention in 1894, the provision in the Constitution barring blacks was affirmed by a vote of 112 to 100. Later, Debs thought this might have had a crucial effect on the outcome of the Pullman strike, for black workers were in no mood to cooperate with the strikers. In June 1894, workers at the Pullman Palace Car Company went on strike. One can get an idea of the kind of support they got, mostly from the immediate vicinity of Chicago in the first months of the strike, from a list of contributions put together by the Reverend William H. Carwardine, a Methodist pastor in the company town of Pullman for 3 years. He was sent away after he supported the strikers. Typographical Union number 16, Painters and Decorators Union number 147, Carpenters Union number 23, 34th Ward Republican Club, Grand Crossing Police, Hyde Park Water Department, Picnic at Gardener's Park, Milk Dealers Union, Hyde Park Liquor Dealers, 14th Precinct Police Station, Swedish Concert, Chicago Fire Department, German Singing Society, check from Anaconda, Montana. Excuse me. The Pullman strikers appealed to a convention of the American Railway Union for support. Mr. President and brothers of the American Railway Union, we struck at Pullman because we were without hope. We joined the American Railway Union because it gave us a glimmer of hope. 20,000 souls, men, women, and little ones, have their eyes turned toward this convention today, straining eagerly through dark despondency for a glimmer of the heaven-sent message you alone can give us on this earth. You all must know that the proximate cause of our strike was the discharge of 2 members of our grievance committee. 5 reductions in wages. The last was the most severe, amounting to nearly 30%, and rents had not fallen. Water, which Pullman buys from the city at 8 cents a 1,000 gallons, he retails to us at 500% advance. Gas, which sells at 75 cents per 1,000 feet in Hyde Park, just north of us, he sells for $2.25. When we went to tell him our grievances, he said we were all children. Pullman, both the man and the town, and is an ulcer on the body politic. He owns the houses, the schoolhouses, and churches of God in the town he gave his once humble name. And thus the merry war, the dance of skeletons bathed in human tears, goes on, and it will go on, brothers, forever, unless you, the American Railway Union, stop it. End it. Crush it out. The American Railway Union responded. It asked its members all over the country not to handle Pullman cars. Since virtually all passenger trains had Pullman cars, this amounted to a boycott of all trains, a nationwide strike. Soon all traffic on the 24 railway lines leading out of Chicago had come to a halt. Workers derailed freight cars, blocked tracks, pulled engineers off trains if they refused to cooperate. The General Managers Association, representing the railway owners, agreed to pay 2,000 deputies sent in to break the strike. But the strike went on. The Attorney General of the United States, Richard Olney, a former railway lawyer, now got a court injunction against blocking trains on the legal ground that the federal mails were being interfered with. When the strikers ignored the injunction, President Cleveland ordered federal troops to Chicago. On July 6th, hundreds of cars were burned by strikers. The following day, the state militia moved in, and the Chicago Times reported on what followed. Company C, 2nd Regiment, disciplined a mob of rioters yesterday afternoon at 49th and Loomis Streets. The police assisted and finished the job. There is no means of knowing how many rioters were killed or wounded. The mob carried off many of its dying and injured. A crowd of 5,000 gathered. Rocks were thrown at the militia, and the command was given to fire. To say that the mob went wild is but a weak expression. The command to charge was given. From that moment, only bayonets were used. A dozen men in the front line of rioters received bayonet wounds. Tearing up cobblestones, the mob made a determined charge. The word was passed along the line for each officer to take care of himself. One by one, as occasion demanded, they fired point blank into the crowd. The police followed with their clubs. A wire fence enclosed the track. The rioters had forgotten it. When they turned to fly, they were caught in a trap. The police were not inclined to be merciful, and driving the mob against the barbed wires, clubbed it unmercifully. The crowd outside the fence rallied to the assistance of the rioters. The shower of stones was incessant. The ground over which the fights had occurred was like a battlefield. The men shot by the troops and police lay about like logs. In Chicago that day, 13 people were killed, 53 seriously wounded, 700 arrested. Before the strike was over, perhaps 34 were dead. With 14,000 militia troops in Chicago, the strike was crushed. Debs was arrested for contempt of court for violating the injunction that said he could not do or say anything to carry on the strike. He told the court, "It seems to me that if it were not for resistance to degrading conditions, the tendency of our whole civilization would be downward. After a while, we would reach the point where there would be no resistance and slavery would come." Debs in court denied he was a socialist, but during his 6 months in prison, he studied socialism and talked to fellow prisoners who were socialists. Later he wrote, "I was to be baptized in socialism in the roar of conflict, in the gleam of every bayonet and the flash of every rifle. The class struggle was revealed. This was my first practical struggle in socialism." I want to thank you for joining me. Tune in next time and maybe we'll finish up the chapter. Hopefully, maybe, kind of, sort of. Remember to hit the like and subscribe button and the notification bell, because YouTube's been known to unsubscribe people, and that way you'll be notified when I make a video. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time.